And now, live from England, bringing you news and analysis that you won't find on the corporate and government mainstream media. It's the WideShut Webcast.
Thank you for joining me on this January 30th episode of the WideShut Webcast. I am your host, Keelan Balderson, and for the next hour, we're going to be talking about all things the mainstream media aren't talking about, or at least aren't talking about loudly enough. To learn more about the network, go to resistradio.com, and to stay up to date with all the news that I cover, I urge everyone to visit wideshut.co.uk. I've been keeping that updated the last couple of weeks. I obviously can't cover every story. There's only so many hours in the day, but I try and pick a good cross-section of information so at least people have an overview of where our corrupt leaders are trying to take us. I'm not going to talk about Davos today. I briefly touched on that last week. But, you know, it's the same old story. Racing ahead with this global governance agenda. Not that we haven't already got most of the mechanisms in place for global governance. The UN, NATO, IMF and World Bank. But there are a few obstacles that this Anglo-American, Israeli corporate empire still need to overcome before they can get their full-blown authoritarian state, if you want to put it that way. And one of those obstacles right now is Iran. Sort of a lone wolf out there, really, in the Middle East. I published a couple of stories relating to Iran this week. Firstly, if Israel sways UN, Iran attack will be globally accepted. And I'll paste that link in if you've not seen this article yet. And this basically comes after Israel's ambassador to the UN, somebody called Ron Prosor, delivered a baseless speech against Iran in New York to the UN Security Council, basically saying the UN has to take action now because Iran is the world's biggest threat. Obviously, he offered no evidence to back up what he was saying, just a completely ridiculous warmongering speech. Iran is not a threat to anybody. They're not threatening anybody. They've never invaded another country. They've never expressed any intent to produce nuclear weapons. There's not one shred of evidence against them. In fact, this is a quote that Ahmadinejad said to CBS News in 2010. This is the president of Iran's stance on nuclear weapons. This is what he said. The nuclear bomb is a fire against humanity rather than a weapon for defense. Its possession is disgusting and shameful. Even more shameful is the threat to use such weapons. So, who has the moral high ground here? Ron Prosor, who represents a country that has hundreds of nuclear weapons, who is outright threatening to attack Iran with no evidence, or Iran, who has no nuclear weapons and is not threatening to attack anyone? Or let's throw America in the mix there, a nation that has used nuclear weapons in the past. Or Britain, that has at least 160 nuclear weapons. You know, which nations have invaded country after country after country for hundreds of years? Iran or America and Britain? In modern times, with Israel shouting orders from the sidelines as well. We got this back to front. Or at least the average citizen who believes the mainstream media has got this back to front. I'll get into the article. Prosor brashly claimed yesterday, never has it been so clear Iran is seeking to build a nuclear weapon. of course he provided absolutely no evidence to support his assertion, there's no clarity at all. Just as there was no solid evidence of Gaddafi's crimes, no WMDs in Iraq, and no evidence bin Laden was behind 9/11 or that Afghanistan played a major role. Just because these people say it and the media repeats it doesn't mean it's true. Nothing they ever say holds up to logic or scrutiny. Take, for example, ProSour's next assertion that Tehran's efforts to enrich uranium to 20% levels could serve no plausible aim other than to develop an atomic bomb. It sounds like a reasonable statement to those flicking through the mainstream news channels, but current nuclear technology means the only possible way to make an atomic bomb is to enrich uranium at above 85%. Therefore, Iran simply does not have the capability to develop a nuclear weapon, and if they were pursuing that path, they are years and years away from being anywhere close. Furthermore, even if they were enriching uranium above 20%, which there is no evidence for, they would also need transportation, the actual warheads, delivery systems, which you guessed it, there is no evidence for. Stop and ask yourself, who are the fundamentalists, the religious fundamentalists? Who are the extremist nutjobs? Perhaps it's about time we started talking about Jewish extremists and Jewish terrorists. You know, it almost sounds like a dirty word to say the word Jew if you're not a Jew. Well, to me it does anyway. I get a funny feeling saying it. Why is that? It's Jewish terrorists that are assassinating people within Iran. It's Jewish terrorists that run around, all over the world like they're above the law. Remember when Mossad were caught with British passports murdering somebody? Let's not get it twisted. Our leaders are absolutely in bed with these Jewish terrorists, as are America. It's an Anglo-American Israeli empire, you can describe it that way, with Europe tagging along. In fact, really, it's a corporate empire hiding behind nation states. Israel's obviously a little more entrenched within the Israeli state, but, our leaders, people that run our countries, just happen to be living here. The corporations are multinational. They don't really claim any alliance to Britain. They don't represent the people of Britain. Nothing they ever do benefits the people of Britain. Here's an article. Britain knew Mossad was using fake passports. Just in case you think I'm talking out of my ass. The US has admitted to funding Jundullah, or Jundullah, depending how you want to pronounce it, which is an Iranian opposition terrorist group. To me, that makes America the terrorists. 27th of May 2007, The Telegraph, Bush sanctions black ops against Iran. President George W. Bush has given the CIA approval to launch covert black operations to achieve regime change in Iran, intelligence sources have revealed. That was back in 2007. They're admitting that they're attempting a coup d'etat, the overthrowing of a sovereign country's leader. Based on what? I've got no idea. There's no evidence. There's no nuclear threat. But they go ahead anyway, and they're bold enough to tell us in the newspapers. Unfortunately, the news cycles that repeat garbage every hour never seem to repeat these important facts, do they? It's on the back pages of the Washington Post or something. That's what the West and Israel do. We are the terrorists. Well, we aren't. The mafia that runs things are the terrorists. But they just point the finger over there and say they're the terrorists, so they get away with it. And most of the public just go along with it. And in fact, it's not the first time that we've forced regime change in Iran. We overthrew Iran's democratically elected leader, Mossadegh, back in the 50s. That's in the history books. British intelligence took him out so the oil companies could steal the oil, because he wanted to nationalise it and export it himself. Nothing's changed. That's who we are. That's who our leaders are. That's who they've always been. But that's not what resistance radio is, and that's why we're talking about it. But anyway, the point of the article, if Israel sways UN, Iran attack will be globally accepted. It's the same thing. Look back at Libya. The UN passed the resolution, and everyone went along with it, because it's the UN. This superpower, this God that you just have to obey because well, that's just the way it is. It doesn't matter that thousands of people were protesting in support of Gaddafi. It doesn't matter that the minority of rebels have ties to Al-Qaeda. Because the global government have written it down on a piece of paper and said this is now legal, for some reason it makes it legal. I mean, what is legal anyway? It's just a word. It's not moral, it's not just. You can pass laws for anything. Look at the drug laws in the West. It's ridiculous. The criminals hide behind a piece of paper, and because that piece of paper says they can invade a country, they happily go and murder thousands of innocent people. Oh, it was in line with the UN resolution. So what? Are you going to do what a piece of paper tells you? That's what the UN is. It's a propaganda tool to make immoral, illegal, well, there's never a moral war in my opinion, but to make wars appear legal. And to make it look like there's this support from the global community. Really, it's just a place where the bigger countries bully the little countries into doing what they want under this guise of well, it's democracy, look, everyone's got a seat, it's fair. And then just look at the history of the UN. It was the globalist think tanks that created the UN. Its headquarters are in New York City. The land was donated by the Rockefellers. I ever read Rockefeller's memoir, David Rockefeller? This infamous quote, "Some even believe we are part of a cabal, working against the best interests of the United States, categorizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it." He's proud of giving away American sovereignty to supranational, centralized powers. You don't even have to connect the dots anymore. The picture is right there for everybody to see. And Iran is one of the next steps in this one world, if you will. Now, I briefly touched on Israel's assassinations in Iran, the CIA's black ops in Iran that Bush signed off on in 2007. Now, it's really a kind of Cold War kind of thing going on. Proxy attacks, secret operations. Iran is being attacked from all angles. But the wider public don't know that. All while the corporate and government mainstream media make Iran the bad guy? Well, one other way that they're destabilizing Iran, which only really occurred to me the other day, I just thought about it and thought, oh yeah, well, it's drugs, the opium. And this is the article I wrote the other day. I'll paste the link. Iranians suffering from Afghan-US opium cultivation. And when you think about it, it's obvious. But not many people have brought this up before. Here's what I wrote. One of the underreported consequences of the US-led war of aggression in Afghanistan is the effect opium is having on neighboring Iran. Estimates of the number of opium heroin addicts in Iran range between 2 to 3 million, making it the most addicted country in the world per capita. According to the United Nations, some 60% of Afghanistan's opium yield ends up crossing the border into Iran, where 2.8% of Iranians over 15 regularly consume the life-destroying drug. Iran, like most other countries of the world, has had a heroin problem for many years, but its current spike of addiction is inextricably linked to the Western invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. During the Taliban's rule, which began in the 90s following the defeat of the Soviets, the Muslim fundamentalists outlawed poppy cultivation for being un-Islamic. It was only after Bush, Blair and co. began bombing the country under the baseless pretense that 9/11 was orchestrated from there, that the Taliban were forced to cultivate the crop in order to fund the defense from the unjust onslaught. Thus, it could be argued that the West are to blame for Iran's spiraling drug problem. This argument is strengthened by the fact that US forces have never mounted a serious mission to destroy the poppy fields. In fact, in some instances, they have admitted to protecting farmers and helping them to cultivate the crop. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the Geraldo Rivero clip for Fox News, where he talks of this troop who basically admits that they're protecting the poppies. They do keep taking the video down, but the link in the article, there should be a working version of it on there if you want to check it out later. Their spin is that if they didn't tolerate the farmers, the population would turn against them in support of the Taliban. But this is circular reasoning at its best. The very fact that drugs are being produced is supporting the Taliban. And the idea that they can win over the hearts and minds of Afghan citizens while occupying their country is illogical and demonstrably false. Not only does poll after poll show that locals don't want the troops there, 92% of Afghans have never even heard of the 9/11 attacks, the faux reason their country is occupied. It seems the only way troops can win over anyone is with bribes, including cash and Viagra. It's funny, yeah, they actually give these warlords and Taliban Viagra because, you know, they're old geezers and they want to keep their women in check, I guess. Not exactly the most moral or effective strategy for creating freedom and democracy. So what other purpose may there be to protect the poppy fields? As we've previously reported, America's Central Intelligence Agency has a long history of trafficking illegal drugs to fund their covert operations. Those that follow deep politics will understand that the war in Afghanistan is not an isolated conflict. It's part of a wider strategy known as full-spectrum dominance. Simply put, it's about complete imperialist control over the Middle East and parts of Africa, which in turn marks a line in the sand for a second Cold War involving Russia and likely China. That's why they lied about 9/11. That's why they lied about Iraq. That's why they lied about Libya. And that's why we're bombing Pakistan, Yemen and Somalia. And there's a video in the article from General Wesley Clark, who came out and admitted that, yep, the plan by the neocons, who are obviously tied in with Israel, dual Israeli citizens and stuff involved in it, and the plan was to invade all these countries, even before they'd come up with fake reasons to invade the countries. There was just this long list of countries that they were going to invade. And obviously Afghanistan was already on the books before 9/11. It was just the new Pearl Harbor that allowed the public and everyone to get on board and for the whole war on terror to kick off. Iran is also a central target on that list and fits the mold perfectly. Like Iraq's WMDs, officials are saber-rattling about a non-existent nuclear weapons program. Like Libya, they're imposing economic sanctions. Well, in the case of Iran, it's economic sanctions. Dig a little deeper, and we also find out that Israel and the Western powers are assassinating people within Iran and funding domestic terror attacks. If destabilization of the country is the aim before any full-blown military intervention, then addicting a large percentage of the population to opium-based drugs is a pretty sweet bonus, if not the intended goal. Last year, Iranian President Ahmadinejad himself pointed the finger at the West for Iran's drug problem. He told a 20,000-strong rally of former addicts, "Today, the Western powers have begun harming nations, especially the Iranian nation, by drugs," he told the crowd. Arrogant states masquerade themselves behind the so-called humanitarian masks, and they want to stir a sense of inability in other nations. They put on masks of freedom-seeking, human rights, and protecting people, but in fact they are the biggest criminals in the world. It's hard to disagree with him. And I put here, especially when the US CIA were caught shipping crack cocaine directly into Los Angeles ghettos in the 80s so they could fund their dirty war in Nicaragua. And if you want to read up on that, there's a book by Gary Webb called Dark Alliance, which pretty much breaks down all that. It's a bit of a Bible of a read, but it lays it all out. He was basically a journalist that uncovered it all. And it wasn't just a way for the CIA to make money to fund its covert operations. It also simultaneously helped pull down the Black Power movement. They'd already taken out all the Black Panther leaders, framed some of them, put them in jail, assassinated others. Malcolm X was gone, Martin Luther King was gone. There was no prominent voice within the Black Power movement. And then they shipped crack cocaine in, and you start getting this black-on-black gang warfare, specifically in LA, elsewhere as well, but the bigger problem was there. And then, whether this was a coincidence or not, you get the big music labels, kind of corrupting this empowering, upbeat rap music, real rap music about the real struggle, and made it into this commercial, cartoony, obviously still very violent, gangster rap. And you get this kind of perfect storm that kept the ghettos in LA from progressing. But anyway, Iran is under attack from all angles, and it seems drug warfare may be another tactic to add to the list. Now, there isn't really any direct evidence that the US is shipping drugs into Iran. There's no planes that have come down or anything like that. But that's kind of the beauty of it. They don't need to do it directly. The very presence of the troops in Afghanistan has caused the opium to increase, and has therefore caused it to increase into Iran. And when you know the reasons for being in Afghanistan are a fraud, and there was this list of countries they wanted to invade, then you can start connecting the dots. And it's not just Iran. Russia has a growing problem. Every country in the world is a victim of this, because 90% or so of the world's heroin comes from Afghanistan. We're locking up non-violent drug addicts, at least in America, for, which is partly due to the West itself. It doesn't make much sense. We're living in a sick, backwards world. And moving on, as many of you know, there's an election brewing in the United States, and Iran is one of the talking points. Everyone but Ron Paul basically saying, oh, we'll do anything, Israel wants, we'll do anything against Iran we need to. Blabbing on about this nuclear threat that doesn't exist. And this brings me to the next article. Zionist casino kingpin is Gingrich's top donator. And this story's got around this week. All over the mainstream media as well, really. But this is what I wrote. When deciding who to support for the 2012 US presidential run, it's easy to get swept up by the sound bites presented in the mainstream media. So-and-so will do this, so-and-so will do that, let's create jobs, God bless America. However, a more accurate way to determine who a presidential nominee truly represents is to look at who is donating to their campaign. More specifically, who are the biggest donators to their campaign. There is democracy in America. It's the best democracy money can buy. Take Republican nominee Newt Gingrich. His official website states that his experiences as the son of a career soldier convinced him at an early age to dedicate his life to his country and the protection of freedom. Good for Newt. But who exactly is donating to him? Judging by his statement, you might think the military are big contributors. Wrong. In truth, the military don't even rank on his top contributors list. In fact, it came out this week that Newt's top donor isn't even somebody that has their full allegiance to the United States. Meet Sheldon Adelson. Adelson is an elite Jewish Zionist with dual Israeli citizenship who made his mega billions as a Las Vegas casino mogul. Yeah, you think the mob moved out of Las Vegas. Perhaps the Italian mob moved out of Las Vegas, but it seems the Jewish mafia is still there. When he's not buying politicians, opposing a two-state solution in Israel, or upgrading Jewish lobby AIPAC's headquarters, he's being investigated by the FBI for possible violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Such a nice guy. 10 million has been funneled into Gingrich's campaign by Adelson and his wife Miriam. Not directly, of course, but through a political action committee run by a former Gingrich aide. This whopping donation is right up there with the largest in US political history. So what exactly is Adelson buying from Gingrich? Well, not surprisingly, it's his unequivocal support for the Zionist state of Israel. This is probably why Newt made the infamous Palestinians are an invented people line. Because Jews are God's chosen people, and that's of course a scientific fact. Adelson praised his puppet's comment while addressing hundreds of youths visiting Israel for Hanukkah celebrations. He stated, "Read the history of those who call themselves Palestinians." Those who call themselves Palestinians. Yeah. And you will hear why Gingrich said recently that the Palestinians are an invented people. Perhaps Adelson would like to join one of the EDL's pro-Israel rallies in the UK. They too want a nation for the indigenous people without all those Muslimics messing things up. Another area that Adelson is likely influential on is Gingrich's stance on Iran, the non-nuclear state that doesn't have the capability to produce nuclear weapons and who have never stated that they want to. At the 2011 Republican Jewish Coalition Presidential Candidates Forum, Gingrich promised to fund every dissident group in Iran, essentially greenlighting terror attacks, similar to the Bush administration's support of terror group Jundallah. He also showed support for sabotaging Iran's oil supply, which could be considered an act of war. You'd think the son of a career soldier, he'd realise that most servicemen don't actually like being blown up in foreign lands, especially when there's no reason to be there. This is perhaps why the military are not donating to Gingrich and instead are the largest donators to Ron Paul, who wants to bring the troops home and end all wars of aggression. So who do you support? a man willing to send your children overseas to die for a Jewish casino mogul, or a man who has full support of the military and wants to bring them safely home to America? Folks, there's no democracy. There's lobbyists and money. They just create the illusion of democracy. You know, do you want the bought and paid for puppet on the left, or the bought and paid for puppet on the right? It doesn't make sense. You know, how did we accept a system where the richest people are allowed to donate to politicians? They're allowed to lobby and get laws changed and create new laws. Can you create a law? Can you go out to a politician and say, "Oh, you're right, Cameron. You're right, Obama. I'd like this law, please." It's ridiculous. How did this ever be considered normal? How did it get this way? How is any regular person supposed to get change when you've got casino moguls donating millions to politicians? It's the very definition of corruption, but for some reason that's now the definition of politics. It's really corporate fascism. The revolving door. You know, they leave a giant corporation to join politics. The corporation bankrolls them into, you know, doing their bidding, changing the laws, getting war started. And then when they leave politics, they go back to the corporate world and sit on a cushy job. Look at Tony Blair. He invades Iraq, and then when he leaves, he makes millions consulting on oil deals. You know, the obvious ones, you know, Dick Cheney and Halliburton. The system is rotten. People need to get out of this game, because that's all it is. It's a game that everyone's playing. It's like a TV game show. You know, you pick your winner, you phone in and make your vote. But it ultimately means nothing. You know, the winner of the Big Brother house means nothing. The winner of the presidential campaign means nothing. It's exactly the same. It's just a game show. The New World Order agenda goes ahead regardless. But anyway, moving on to another story, we jump to another country that's on this full spectrum dominance list that General Wesley Clark exposed, and that's Syria. And basically, although the Syrian regime does appear to be more violent, in my opinion, than Gaddafi's, at least since the conflict has started, it's basically the same tactic that the West is using. Fund a minority of rebels, give them arms, and then as the conflict kicks off, pump out the propaganda against the government for trying to stop this armed assault against them. The Western establishment are pushing through a resolution in the UN that will give Syrian President Bashar al-Assad 15 days to step down before tougher measures are taken. British Foreign Secretary William Hague and French ministers are attending a meeting in New York to make it clear that the globalists will not allow the Middle Eastern people to determine their own future. Meanwhile, Russia understandably remains sceptical, preferring to study the recommendations and conclusions of the observer mission in detail before carelessly voting for any intervention that could put their own nation at risk. The ever-increasing influence the West has over the region is creating a Cold War bulldozer right on their border. Although the plight of some Syrian citizens against the Assad regime shouldn't be ignored, it's also well established that the Western Empire and Israel have had Syria on their list of countries to invade since 2001.
So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
NATO has no moral high ground or credibility to act as the world's policeman, especially when they only go after countries that provide business for the corporations and strategic military positions for a second Cold War against Russia, Iran and China. In a laughably hypocritical statement, the French Foreign Ministry said they will be in New York to convince the Security Council to assume its responsibilities in the face of the worsening of crimes against humanity by the Syrian regime, completely ignoring their own crimes against humanity in the bombing campaign against Libyan citizens. In an equally hypocritical statement, Prime Minister Cameron said, Russia can no longer explain blocking the UN and providing cover for the regime's brutal repression, ignoring his own sale of weapons to the Bahrain regime that's brutally repressing the people of that nation. We should also not underestimate the power of propaganda. Like with Libya, the Western media are significantly skewing the reality of what's happening on the ground. British journalist Lizzie Phelan, who has been reporting first-hand for the past week, revealed that the violent aspects of the conflict are between a minority of armed rebels and state forces. She stressed in an interview with Syrian TV that what she has seen during her visit is that life is normal and that regular people go to their businesses and schools in spite of some problems. If this was truly a civil war, you'd expect the whole nation to be against the government or a diametrically opposed split between the public. She asserted that the city of Damascus is very safe, as she has been moving in it alone in the late hours of the night and has not been faced with any problem or seen any big anti-government protests. On the contrary, Phelan pointed out that she saw a huge pro-government rally in the Umayyad Square where President Assad came out to directly speak to the people. She said this was very interesting for her, since the likes of BBC and Al Jazeera claim that the Syrian people are not with the president. Tens of thousands of people gathered in the square and were very glad to see him and expressed their love and support for him. This raises several important questions. If the majority of people are going about their daily lives under the quote brutal dictatorship without any trouble, and thousands of people are out in the streets supporting the president, can you imagine Britain supporting Cameron in this way? What do you expect the government to do when armed rebels are trying to take over? If, for example, Occupy London took up arms with backing from Iran, do you think Cameron would hand over power, or would there be martial law on the streets? Granted, there are scenes of unarmed protesters being viciously beaten and tens of deaths reported in the media, but there are also a lot of inconclusive videos and clear propaganda films floating around the internet purporting to be Syrian forces shooting civilians. Take this video claiming tanks are firing at people, when it's obvious the sound has been dubbed or they are simply shots being fired into the air as a dispersement measure. The US fire smoke cannons for the same reasons. It's also worth mentioning that the vicious assaults by police in the US, Britain and Europe against peaceful protesters are not exactly too far behind what we see in Syria. If our governments have the right to stomp out dissent, why do those same governments have the right to condemn Middle Eastern governments for doing the same, when they also have to contend with armed resistance? Not that it would happen, but there's no telling how many innocent civilians would be caught up in gunfire if some Occupy protesters took up arms. Also, considering this is an armed conflict, who exactly are arming the rebels and causing the violence? Reports out in the last few days suggest Israeli weapons have found their way into the hands of the rebels. Doesn't this make Assad completely justified in protecting his country from what is really an outside threat? According to former CIA officer Philip Giraldi, NATO and the CIA also have a huge part to play. NATO is already clandestinely engaged in the Syrian conflict, with Turkey taking the lead as a US proxy, Giraldi writes. Unmarked NATO warplanes are arriving at Turkish military bases close to the Syrian border, delivering weapons from the late Muammar Gaddafi's arsenals, as well as volunteers from the Libyan Transitional National Council, who are experienced in pitting local volunteers against trained soldiers, a skill they acquired confronting Gaddafi's army. This is backed up in the mainstream media. The Telegraph calmly reported in November of last year that Syrian rebels held secret talks with Libya's new authorities, aiming to secure weapons and money for their insurgency against President al-Assad's regime. So the unjustified campaign in Libya that slaughtered thousands of innocent civilians and put an al-Qaeda-linked Sharia regime in power is now being used as a proxy to foment the exact type of intervention in Syria. These are very sick people we're dealing with. This also rubbishes the claim that the observer mission had to be cut short due to a surge in violence. We now know who was behind that violence, the very criminals calling for intervention. There is a people's resistance enveloping the globe. If the Syrian people want to overthrow their government, it is the Syrian people who should do the overthrowing. The legitimate protesters have the support of many people in the West. At the same time, if the West wants to create change and put an end to the crony corporate empire, it is only us that can accomplish it. All government is corrupt. To have Western governments interfere with the Middle East is hypocritical and immoral. We now know, as always, that it is the West and Israel fomenting the violence in Syria, making the whole mainstream media narrative an abhorrent lie. The only reason they're going after Syria is because it will help them go one step further in their agenda for global government, something all people of the world need to protest in solidarity together. For more on this story and other recent headlines, please visit wideshut.co.uk or visit the links in the info box below. And that video will be up shortly after the show, along with the show. I've been trying to do videos regularly now. I've been doing it for the last week or so, corresponding with articles that I've been posting up on the website. If you've not checked out my YouTube channel before, go to youtube.com/WideShutUK. You can find all my films on there as well, including 7/7, What Did They Know, and the London riots film, The Perfect Storm. I've got other films planned for the future, but right now I'm just going to be focusing on news and getting this new format going and trying to make it a regular thing. There are a couple other stories we could get to as well that aren't to do with overthrowing countries, unless you consider it overthrowing our own country. Obviously, the big news in Britain recently has been this RBS chief who was going to get £1 million bonus, and there was a big uproar in the media, rightfully so, because it's ridiculous considering we, the taxpayer, bailed out that bank. And then this guy swoops in and gives himself bonuses. But now he's come out and rejected that bonus, which appears to be a way to pacify the public, to say, oh no, it's not all bad, look, he's rejected it, everything's fine, run along. I did this short article earlier today, which I'll read out to you. After public backlash, Hester rejects £1 million bonus. Only after considerable public backlash has RBS chief Stephen Hester decided against accepting $963,000 in bonus shares from the public bailed out bank. Don't think this is a victory over the corrupt banking system, however. It was also announced today that this is essentially a one-off to pacify the public, as the government will not exercise its state control over the bank to block any other ludicrous bonuses. Norman Smith, a Downing Street spokesperson, told the press, is Norman a woman's name? Because it says spokeswoman. Nevertheless, Norman Smith, the Downing Street spokeswoman, told the press that it's up to the executives to sort out any problems and to run the bank. It's up to them who accepts bonuses. They are doing a good job and making good progress, she told the BBC. Yeah, a good job of paying themselves the public's tax money while we're forced into further austerity. The government was never in a position to bail anybody out. They are bankrupt and can only borrow money at our future expense. Labour, who have not mounted a serious offensive against the inherently failing financial system, are playing the typical controlled opposition, vowing to maintain pressure on the bonus culture while ignoring the root issues. In the grand scheme of things, this story is a blip compared to the real problem. As long as banks can create money out of thin air through the fractional reserve system, which they do through loans, they only have to keep 10% back of what they loan out, and as that money's loaned out, it goes into another bank account, another private banking company, and then if somebody takes that out, it goes into another bank, and so on, and you get all this fake money, blowing up out of nowhere, and then they can call it all back, and everything comes crashing back down again. The trick is to keep the growth going, but it's not sustainable. As long as banks can create money out, I've just said that. As long as they can gamble with depositors' money and create valueless derivatives, and as long as the government protect corporate losses with our money, because that's basically what they do when a bank collapses because it's gambled and took risks, then the government essentially uses us as the collateral. That sounds fair, doesn't it? The economy will always be at risk and will always be a Ponzi scheme, because that's essentially what it is. If they collapse, our money goes up to them. Furthermore, as long as government borrows from the private sector while already being completely bankrupt, the people will always be in austerity, slaves to the government's credit card. Again, where's the logic? The government the true national debt figure is 4.8 trillion. Imagine if you were 4.8 trillion in debt. Would you borrow any more? Well, that's what the government does. They borrow more. They have to borrow more to keep funding themselves, because that's the mechanism they've given themselves to fund all these illegal wars and everything they're doing. But we pick up the tab. You see, they talk about getting the deficit down. Well, that's at our expense. That's cuts to public services. And it always makes me laugh when people talk about their tax money. They're stealing tax money. The benefits cheats are taking my tax money that could go to schools or hospitals. With 4.8 trillion in debt, it doesn't really matter anymore. We're too far gone to worry about a few benefits cheats. And that's pretty much that article in a nutshell. I think we'll leave it there, folks. Be sure to come back in half an hour for the reality check show with Blue Bus. But from me, I'll catch you next week. Let's go to some Aerosmith again, I think. I feel like eating some rich people. I don't know about you.
If you found the preceding information valuable, please consider buying a DVD or making a small donation of your choosing. Go to wideshut.co.uk/donate. That's wideshut.co.uk/donate. You are the resistance.